Alright guys, it's time for a pop quiz or pop test, whatever you want to call it. What you're looking at here is Clair Obscur Expedition 33 running on my test bench on an RTX 3080 at 1440p. I'm not going to tell you the settings or preset each side is using, but I want to know if you would be able to easily tell the difference between the two sides and guess correctly. The right side could be ultra, the left could be medium, or it could be high on the left and low on the right. Now I know YouTube's compression is also butchering the quality, so it might be harder, but try to see if you can spot the differences in the details. Now before I give you the answer, let's move on to another example. This is Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, and this game looks phenomenal, and I think this example here is harder than the last one because, me personally, I really couldn't tell the difference until I really started to squint my eyes. Let's find out what you guys guessed and if you guessed correctly.
Hey, if you enjoy content like this, drop a like, make sure to subscribe, and smash that bell so you never miss another video.
Hey, what is going on guys? Danny here, welcome back to the channel and I hope you've all been doing well. When it comes to gaming on the PC, we have the freedom to customize our graphics in almost any way possible, whether you're going for max visual fidelity, maximum performance, or whether you want to strike a good balance between the two. However, when it comes to ultra, epic, or maximum settings, I personally feel like these quality settings are wasteful for the vast majority of gamers, unless you're someone who's rocking a very high-end enthusiast graphics card like an RTX 4090 or 5090, and you have the performance headroom to spare. I'm going to elaborate more on that in just a moment, but let's circle back to the examples we were looking at the start of this video. So the first one was Expedition 33, and if you had guessed that the left side was using ultra settings while the right side was set to high, then you'd be correct. But if you didn't guess correctly, then honestly, I don't blame you because the differences between the two sides is very marginal at best. In this particular example, the ultra side offers a bit more foliage on the ground, level of details and draw distances is a bit higher, and there's some subtle extra details in the distant fog and volumetric lighting. And Gustav's hair is a bit more shaded using ultra settings. Honestly, I had to really search hard and look for the differences, but when you're actually playing the game and are in the heat of battle, it's not something, I personally notice. Now, what about the second example from Kingdom Come Deliverance 2? Well, if you had guessed that the left side was ultra and the right side was set to high, then you would be correct again. But if you're looking at this and going, I can't really see the difference at all between the two, then you're definitely not alone in that, because the differences here are very minor. The foliage, shadows, they are a bit more softer on the ultra side and appear more natural on the tree trunks, and there's a small and subtle difference in the distance with the foliage due to the higher draw distance. But when moving through this area within the game itself, the differences were practically invisible to me, and it wasn't until I went back and reviewed the footage and examined closely what the differences were that I started to notice them. So here's the thing, ultra or maximum settings, it sounds fancy at first, right? And one might actually think that is the level you should be aiming for. I mean, who doesn't want to enjoy higher visual fidelity? But personally, I feel like these quality settings are a trap, and if you're after smooth gameplay, you'd be much better off avoiding it unless you're okay with a 30 FPS gameplay experience, or are using it to take screenshots, or like I said earlier, have a super high-end graphics card, which, I mean, the 99% of gamers are not going to afford. And a lot of games, going from high to ultra barely makes any noticeable difference or changes, as we saw from those previous examples. Yet it can tank your FPS significantly, and in some cases, those extra settings crank up things like shadows or reflections to the point where you can't even notice the difference when it comes to motion. Today, I'm going to be proving that to you with some real benchmarks and some side-by-side comparisons so you can stop wasting performance for nothing, and why ultra or max settings are just plain stupid in my opinion. Just wait until you see the benchmarks and performance differences. In some cases, avoiding ultra or max, we were seeing very, very large differences, north of 60% just from changing the slider one notch down to high, and the visual downgrade was negligible. And before we dive in, let me know in the comments, do you always go for ultra settings, or do you tweak your settings for a mixture between high or ultra or medium? Do you like to go for a balance between FPS and visuals? So I'm curious to know what your take on this is. So before we jump into the benchmarks and test footage, I wanted to go over my system specifications. For the CPU, we have a Ryzen 7 9800X3D paired with 32GB of DDR5, 6200CL28 memory, running on my MSI X870 Tomahawk motherboard. For our GPU, we're testing with the MSI RTX 3080 Gaming Trio, and the reason why I wanted to test this GPU in particular is because essentially I'm killing two birds with one stone here, where we're showing performance on a 5-year-old GPU that at this point can start to show its age and would be considered more of a lower to mid-tier card. So this will show us what a gamer buying this GPU from, say, the used market to save money, or someone who hasn't upgraded, what they're going to have to do to attain playable performance. Because I'll tell you this right now, if you're someone who is expecting that an RTX 3080 can still max out new games coming out today, you're going to have a bad time. And so the second reason is that this way, I'm also able to do a revisit of this GPU that I've been wanting to do for a while now and see how it performs in 2025. Sure, I could test with a higher end graphics card like the RX 9070 XT or the RTX 4090, but those cards wouldn't be as limited of their performance and capabilities in handling those higher visuals in new games. And I really wanted to emphasize here how you could turn a situation where you have a GPU, an older GPU that is, that may not look as viable at first, and then with one slider, with one tick down, you can all of a sudden breathe new life into it. And I tested all of these games at 1440p with no upscaling, so just native resolution, and I didn't use any ray tracing here either. Alright, with all of that out of the way, let's jump into the benchmarks, and I wanted to circle back to Clair Obscur Expedition 33 because while we already looked at the Ultra versus High in terms of the visuals, we haven't gone over the performance differences, and as you guys can see from the performance metrics, there's a pretty substantial difference. We see our average FPS has improved by a whopping 45%, while our 1% lows increased by 57%, all by simply dropping from Ultra settings to High settings. That's pretty freaking insane because it's not like we're dropping from Ultra to Medium or Low, but we're just going one notch or one tick down. And visually, the game still looks awesome, but performance is way better and gameplay is much more smoother. And one could argue that for a turn-based game like this, you could tolerate a lower frame rate, but this game has some pretty cool dodge and parry mechanics, and timing is everything. So having that higher, smoother FPS can certainly help. Me personally, I would go with high settings over Ultra any day because I don't care about having some extra grass blades or some shadows or clouds that look slightly better in the distance if it means taking such a large, big FPS hit. Next up is Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, and just look at this. Walking through Kuttenberg, and I barely could spot any differences between Ultra and High. But here's the kicker, by simply dropping one preset down, our average FPS shot up by 32%, and 1% lows improved by 35%. That's a huge uplift with almost no visual trade-off. Now to be fair, Ultra wasn't playable, the RTX 3080 handled it fine. But why settle for 91 FPS when you can push well into the 120s and make those dips practically disappear? If you ask me, High is a no-brainer here. Now let's talk about Oblivion Remastered, and visually this was another case where I had to squint to see any meaningful difference between Ultra and High. If you really pause and study the image, Ultra does add a touch more detail in the distant foliage and maybe slightly denser shadows, and you get a little more softness in the fog during those misty areas. But in actual gameplay, it's virtually the same experience. Textures, lighting, and overall the scene looks almost identical in motion. Now here's where things get crazy. Performance on Ultra, we averaged about 57 FPS with 1% lows at 49, but just dropping down to High, the average skyrockets to 91 FPS and the 1% lows jump to 72. That's a 60% improvement in performance while the game still looks great. So again, the same theme continues. Why would you tank your frame rate by almost half just to get a little extra shadow fidelity? High is the sweet spot here, no question about it. Monster Hunter Wilds is a game I've criticized a lot at this point because of how atrociously it runs, and honestly, even after multiple updates, things still aren't great. Now visually, looking at Ultra versus High, the differences are almost invisible during gameplay. Maybe you might notice slightly thicker grass clusters or a hint more shadow details on Ultra, if you freeze the frame that is, but in motion, it's practically the same. And that's not to say, Ultra looks amazing or anything. It still looks pretty bad if you ask me, and the performance really just doesn't justify it. So the kicker here is performance barely moves when dropping from Ultra to High. We averaged 56 FPS with 1% lows at 42, and switching to High only bumps up the frame rate to 59 FPS, with 1% lows at 47. That's just a 5% gain, not even close to what we saw in the other titles. So in this case, high doesn't magically save the day because the game is just so poorly optimized across the board. But still, if visual difference is negligible, why throw away the extra performance? Even if it is only a couple of frames. For this one, you're basically stuck unless Capcom does a miracle patch. Let's move on to Call of Duty Black Ops 6, and this one is interesting because when you select the max preset, a lot of the options already cap at high, with only a few of them going to ultra. That means the difference between max and high isn't dramatic at all. In fact, the performance numbers actually reflect that. On max, we're averaging about 101 FPS with 1% lows at 78, while high pushes us to 104 FPS with the same 1% lows. That's basically nothing, and visually it's nearly identical. But then I cranked everything down to low, and here's where things get intriguing. Now yes, the visual downgrade is noticeable here. The textures are flatter, the world loses some of the extra depth, but performance? It gets skyrocketed. We went from 101 FPS to 158 FPS on average, and the 1% lows jumped from 78 to 120. For a game like Call of Duty, where competitive players are laser focused on squeezing every frame possible, this is a no-brainer. And honestly, playing on low can give you a competitive advantage because it reduces unnecessary visual clutter, making enemy visibility much more clearer. So if you're grinding ranked or trying to be competitive in Warzone, low might actually be the meta you follow. Next up is Cyberpunk 2077, and just like with Call of Duty, a lot of the so-called max settings cap out at high, with a few options going to ultra, and then there's screen space reflections at psycho. That one setting alone absolutely hammers performance, but here's the thing, does it make a noticeable difference? Honestly, for me, not really. Looking at the footage, reflections on psycho are maybe a touch sharper and more profound, but during actual gameplay, it's something that I really never noticed. The textures, shadows, lighting set to high already look pretty good. Now check out the performance on maximum. We averaged just 66 FPS average with 1% lows at 54. Drop it down to high and suddenly we're at 118 FPS with 1% lows at 94. That's nearly double the performance for what is essentially the same visual experience. For me, Psycho SSR is a perfect example of a setting designed for screenshots, not gameplay, and at that point you might as well just turn on path tracing. Next up is Spider-Man 2. I honestly struggled to spot any meaningful difference between very high and high settings. Maybe if you zoom in and freeze the frame, you'll notice slightly cleaner reflections on car panels and windows at very high, but textures, lighting, and even crowd density are virtually identical. Now, performance is where it matters. Very high gave us an average of 83 FPS with 1% lows dipping to 40, while high jumped to 99 FPS and 50 for the 1% lows. That's a nice boost for almost no visible trade-off, and considering this is a game where you're zipping through the city at insane speeds, you're not going to notice the extra reflection fidelity, but you will notice a smoother frame rate, that's for sure. Next up is Hogwarts Legacy, and I'll be honest, comparing visuals here is a bit tricky due to the game's dynamic weather. The Ultra side ended up with a overcast sky, while High looked brighter, so do keep that in mind. Even so, when you look at the textures and details, the differences between Ultra and High is minimal. Things like cobblestone roads, the building details and edges, character details still look fantastic on High. Ultra adds some extra shadows and slightly richer lighting, but nothing that stands out during gameplay. Now let's talk about performance. On Ultra, the RTX 30 averaged 107 FPS with 1% lows at 71, while high settings pushed that up to 127 FPS with 1% lows at 83. That's about an 18% uplift in average FPS, and that's a solid bump in lows, making everything feel smoother without any significant loss in visual quality. Easy win for the high settings here, in my opinion. Horizon Forbidden West is a visually stunning game, and honestly, the difference between ultra and high settings is minimal in most gameplay scenarios. When examining the screenshots, textures on Aloy's armor and environmental details like rocks and foliage remain sharp on both settings. Ultra does appear to push a bit more density in shadows and ambient occlusion, but it's the kind of change you'd only notice if you're really actively looking for it in a static comparison. Now onto performance. Moving from Ultra to High results in a small uplift. On Ultra, the RTX 3080 delivers an average of 77 FPS with 1% lows at 70. Switching to High bumps up the average FPS to 80 and 1% lows to 72. That's roughly a 4% improvement, which is negligible for most players. If you're already GPU limited like this, then stick with Ultra for the visuals, but if every frame does matter, then I guess you want to stick with High or go below that, or perhaps turn on upscaling. Alan Wake 2 is a unique case because this game doesn't go beyond high settings for most of the graphical features, meaning there is no true quote-unquote Ultra preset. For the purpose of this test, I maxed out every option, which included a few settings like texture resolution set to ultra, while most others stayed at high. Next notch down was medium, so that's what I had used for this comparison. Looking at the screenshots, the difference between high and medium is noticeable in some areas like volumetric lighting and overall shadow quality, but surprisingly, it's actually not as drastic as you might expect. This is certainly impressive considering the performance jump from an average of 68 FPS at high to 91 FPS at medium, which is a massive 34% uplift. 1% lows improved too, from 59 to 77. For a game as heavy as Alan Wake 2, dropping to medium might be worth it if you're targeting higher frame rates, especially on an RTX 3080 at 1440p. Next up is Black Myth Wukong, and this game is absolutely stunning visually, but it's also incredibly demanding. At max settings called Cinematic, the RTX 3080 struggles hard, averaging just 43 FPS with the 1% lows at 37. And keep in mind, this is at 1440p, not even 4K. The cinematic preset pushes everything to the extreme. You get ultra dense foliage, incredibly sharp shadows, higher resolution textures, and advanced lighting effects that make the forest look almost lifelike. Water reflections are also very sharp with accurate light bounces. The ambient fog also really adds this immersive atmospheric touch. Now, when we drop all the way down to high, skipping the very high preset, performance shoots up dramatically. We go from 43 FPS to 70 FPS on average, with 1% lows hitting 60. That's a 62% increase in frame rate. And honestly, the game still looks beautiful. Foliage density and lighting complexity do take a hit for sure, and reflections in the water are a bit softer, but during fast-paced action combat or traversal, these differences are hard to notice, and I don't think it'd be detrimental for a player to ruin their experience by playing on high. For a game like this with hyper combat, I'd argue smoothness and responsiveness far outweigh those extra visuals and bells and whistles. Moving on, and we have The Last of Us Part 2. When comparing very high to high, the visual gap is almost negligible, while performance gains are significant. On very high, the RTX 3080 delivered an average FPS of 92, with 1% lows at 77, while dropping to high pushed it up to 113 FPS and 96 FPS on the 1% lows. A massive uplift for such minimal quality trade-off. Looking closely, foliage density and texture fidelity remain virtually identical. Grass details and shadow softness in the environment don't show any major differences during traversal. Even reflections in the water when crossing streams retain strong clarity on high settings, with only a slight reduction in surface detail that's hard to notice without zooming in. Distant objects like trees and urban structures maintain their complexity, and lighting across the environment feels nearly identical. Overall, high gives you a big performance win without compromising visual quality and making very high hard to justify unless you're already hitting your target frame rate comfortably. Stalker 2 takes us deep into the zone with highly detailed foliage, dynamic shadows, and atmospheric lighting that defines the gritty realism. On the Epic preset, we're getting an average of 63 FPS, with 1% lows dipping to around 51 FPS, making it the heaviest hitter so far in this comparison. Dropping to the high preset boosts the average FPS to 73, and the 1% lows improve to 59, which is a respectable uplift of about 15 to 16%. The visual difference between the two presets, surprisingly minimal in real-time gameplay. The density and quality of grass and the ground debris remain impressive on high, even in the distance where you see trees and the sky lighting holding up pretty well. Shadows and volumetric effects take the biggest hit when you drop down, but I'd argue you'd be pretty hard-pressed to notice it without a real side-by-side comparison. Considering how taxing Epic is for what amounts to subtle differences, the high preset feels like the sweet spot for smooth performance, without compromising the immersive and post-apocalyptic vibe that Stalker 2 is known for. Looking at the 13-game average chart, the RTX 3080 at 1440p shows a clear advantage when moving from ultra or max settings down to high. High delivers about 27% higher average FPS and 28% better 1% lows, which is a significant improvement for smoother gameplay. This really highlights how just one preset drop can breathe new life into an older GPU. Now, the second chart showing ultra/max performance paints an interesting picture. Despite being nearly 5 years old, the RTX 3080 surprisingly still holds its own in many titles, delivering respectable frame rates in many modern games released within the last couple of years. However, there are several heavy hitters like Oblivion Remastered and Black Myth Wukong where the 1% lows dip hard, making the experience less consistent and a little bit jarring, even when the average FPS looks fine. Not to mention, some games could show potential stuttering issues due to the 3080 running awfully close to its VRAM limit with these presets. Switching to the third chart with high settings changes the story entirely. suddenly almost every title shows consistently smooth performance, with many games breaking past the 90 or 100 FPS mark. 1% low performance also improves drastically across the board, contributing to the more consistent and smooth experience. And keep in mind, these numbers are native performance. If you leverage DLSS in quality mode, you can push these even further, easily achieving a high refresh experience and demanding titles without sacrificing visual fidelity. So there you guys have it. After taking a look at all of the test footage and the results collectively, what's the takeaway here? Honestly, it's pretty simple. Stop obsessing over ultra or maximum settings. I really wanted to bring some awareness to this because you often see people complaining when a new game comes out and that it's unplayable for them on their RTX 3070 or 3060 or 2080. But it might be because they're actually just setting everything to ultra and expecting to get like a smooth experience there. And honestly, for cards that old, it's just not going to happen. Or if you have a newer card that's lower tier, like an RTX 5050, right? Or a 5060, you're not going to have a good time expecting that to run everything ultra 1440p. I mean, I wish that was the case, right? But unfortunately, that's just not how it is. And for the vast majority of games, they're nothing more than a resource hog for a tiny bump in visual fidelity that you're gonna barely notice outside of screenshots. If you want to make a big jump in terms of, visual fidelity, you have to utilize something like path tracing, and that is a totally different ball game. You're going to need something like a 4090 or a 5090, and even then you still got to utilize stuff like upscaling and frame generation. Dropping to high doesn't mean you're sacrificing, your next-gen experience. In fact, you're just enabling smoother gameplay, higher responsiveness, and better 1% lows, which, matter way more when you're in the middle of an intense battle. The RTX 3080, it's going to be nearly 5 years old at this point, but as these results show, with the right settings, this card is still a beast when it comes to 1440p gaming. And then, if you want more performance, you can enable something like DLSS, and you're still golden for years to come. So the next time you launch up a game and, you feel tempted to slam that ultra preset, just ask yourself, do you want, bragging rights for the menu settings, or do you want a buttery smooth experience and performance where it actually counts? For me personally, the only setting that I kind of make an exception for to set it at maximum or ultra is textures. Like, I always want to utilize max textures for those crisp models and details. But other than that, everything else is getting set to either high or even medium, right? I don't care about fancy clouds or fog. I'm not even going to be noticing it while I'm playing the game or traveling. But yeah, this allows me to get the most smoothest experience. So that's going to be wrapping it up for this one, guys. Hope you all learned something. And for now, we'll touch base in the next video. Take care.
If you guys found this video to be informative and entertaining, then leave a like. Let me know your thoughts and comments down below. Be sure to check out the video description for cool links and ways to support the channel, such as using my Amazon affiliate link. And if you're interested in seeing more content like this, then consider subscribing. I'd greatly appreciate it. Thank you guys so much for watching, take care, and I'll see you in the next one.